What is up, guys? Dzeeff here, and welcome back to yet another episode of Weird Yu-Gi-Oh card effects. Now, it's been a few months since the last episode, but we are back, and I couldn't be more excited. If you guys missed any of the previous episodes, there is a playlist that I'll link at the end of today's video so that you can catch up on the series. I also want to mention before we start today's discussion that I just posted a few days ago episode 3 of the Yu-Gi-Oh bulk challenge. Now, this is probably going to be the final episode of the series, but it was a ton of fun. I got to duel against Paul from Team APS, and it looks like the people that saw the episode really enjoyed it. So if you missed that, that'll be on the channel as well, and I'll link it at the end of today's video. For today's video, we're going back to 2006 with Cyberdark Impact. Now, this set has aged pretty well. You know, we have cards like Vanity's Fiend and Vanity's Ruler in it that are obviously very good in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And we also have things like the barrier statues and instant fusion, so there are plenty of great cards in the set. But when this set was released back in 2006, outside of some big winners like Snipe Hunter and Chain Strike, almost all of the cards in it weren't very good in that time period. Like I said, this set got better with age, but on release it was kind of made fun of for a long time. Cyberdark Impact was very experimental, and a lot of the chances that they took when designing these cards really didn't pay off, and a lot of the set was complete garbage, especially when it was released. You had the Chain Link support cards that weren't Chain Strike or Accumulated Fortune. Pretty much all of the ones that weren't those two cards were terrible. You had some pretty bad level monsters that I know do have some fans but aren't very good. Things like a Lore Queen, for example. And finally, you had the absolute worst of the worst, the column cards, and that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. Now, I do want to explain the context of this release, because nowadays column cards are all over the place and they're really great. Things like Infinite Impermanence and archetypes like Mech Knights or Magical Muskets, those all deal with columns, as do many Link monsters in the game, and that's all fine. But at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, people didn't really care about the columns that cards were in. And oftentimes, during duels, people would move around their cards in their back row and in their main monster zone. This sort of thing sounds pretty crazy to any modern Yu-Gi-Oh player, because we've gotten used to not moving our cards around at all, but back in the day, people really didn't care, because prior to this set, there were no cards, as far as I know, that dealt with columns, which meant that, for example, if you opened up your turn with a set monster and 2 set back rows, oftentimes people would put the monster in the middle of the 2 back rows just above it. And then when they used one of the back row cards, they would shift the other back row over to be in line with the monster. These sort of things didn't really matter back then. They sound crazy nowadays, but this is really important, because it means if you wanted to use any of these column cards that I'm going to talk about in today's video, you basically had to tell your opponent you were using these cards, because otherwise they wouldn't really care about following columns. And that is a pretty big downside. Sitting down at a duel and telling your opponent, hey, make sure you don't move any cards, and hey, make sure you use the columns correctly, would give them a ton of information. Now, I do want to mention here that technically you were never allowed to move around your cards, even back then. However, because there were no cards that really cared about columns, nobody would really say anything, except if you were at a feature match at a big tournament, and even then, sometimes they still didn't care. That being said, these cards are all terrible, so no one ever tried playing them at tournaments, at least not to any serious level, and that meant that you wouldn't have to experience that sort of issue. But theoretically, if these cards were good, then every single time you sat down against an opponent, you would have to give away a portion of your strategy just to tell them that they have to play with columns. Sorry for the long intro there, but I really felt it was important to understand what columns looked like in the context of 2006 Yu-Gi-Oh! The first card in today's video is Rampaging Rhinos. I am simply going in the order that these cards were presented in this set itself. So Rampaging Rhinos is a level 3 Earth Beast Warrior effect monster with 1500 attack and defense. The effect on this card says once per turn, this card can move to an adjacent unoccupied monster card zone. If this card attacks the monster in its same column, this card gains 500 attack during the damage step. Now keep in mind at this point we're a little bit less than a year away from Gene Warped Werewolf, which is a level 4 normal monster with 2000 attack. So this card going up to 2000 attack when it attacks an opponent's monster isn't the worst effect ever. That is a lot of attack points on a level 3 monster. However, there are downsides, it has to be attacking and it has to attack a monster in the same column. Now you are allowed to move it around a little bit, to adjacent unoccupied monster card zones, but that's pretty easy to play around. If you put it in the center column, for example, and ran over an opponent's monster, your opponent could simply summon a monster to the leftmost or rightmost column, and you wouldn't really have a great way to move this card over there. Yes, that might sound small, but I think that most players would agree that you would just rather play a 1900 attack monster, and about a year later, most people would consider playing Gene Warped Werewolf over this card just because it's a lot easier to use. The card isn't terrible, but there's not enough of a payoff to actually care about using columns. Next up, we have Storm Shooter, a level 7 winged beast monster with 2300 attack and 500 defense. Wow, for a level 7 monster to only have 2300 attack back in 2006, that must mean that it has a really powerful effect, right? Well, let's take a look. Once per turn, you can select and activate one of these effects. Either move this card to an adjacent unoccupied monster card zone, or return one spell, trap, or monster card on your opponent's side of the field in the same column as this card to its owner's hand. That effect is obviously a lot better than Rampaging Rhinos. Unfortunately, you are not allowed to move the card and bounce a card in the same turn. It is a soft once per turn effect, however, it is obviously a bigger payoff than just gaining 500 attack. So Storm Shooter does have a fairly decent payoff if you manage to make it work. However, keep in mind in 2006, bouncing cards was not nearly as good as it is right now. Basically, bouncing cards became a lot better when people started to use things like synchros and Xyz monsters and link monsters and stuff like that, because then your opponent was investing cards to summon these monsters, and when you bounce them, they don't go back to the hand, they go back into the extra deck. So cards like Storm Shooter were a lot worse back in 2006. Not that the card is good by today's standards, but that is a little bit more context about bouncing back in the day. Storm Shooter is a better designed card than Rampaging Rhinos. The payoff is real here, and while I don't really understand why you're not allowed to use each effect in the same turn, I can sympathize and say, okay, maybe they didn't realize how bad column mechanics would be, and they were trying to preemptively nerf the card. However, this card has no reason to be a level 7 monster, especially by 2006 standards. This requires way too big of an investment, and I don't think that players were really interested in using a card like this at level 7. Now maybe at level 6 with only one tribute, this card could have been pretty interesting, but yeah, at level 7 with only 2300 attack and a pretty situational effect that's not even going to be good against every deck, most players are not going to play this card, and that's pretty much what happened. But still, it is at least a lot better than Rampaging Rhinos. There was also Alien Infiltrator, a level 2 Earth Reptile effect monster with 800 attack and 500 defense. This card says once per turn, this card can move to an adjacent unoccupied monster card zone. If no spell, trap, or monster card on your opponent's side of the field is in the same column as this card, it can attack your opponent directly. So this kind of flips the column mechanic on its head, at least in this set. The previous two monsters wanted things in their columns to get those bonus effects, where with this card you don't want any cards in its column at all, so you can attack your opponent directly. Now I probably don't have to explain, but this card was not very good back in the day. Aliens as an archetype have always struggled in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, and this was not really what they needed. And then we have Senate Switch, a card that was actually bought out back when Link Summoning was announced a few years back, but it did get an errata that I'll mention that makes it a lot worse. For what it's worth though, though I don't think the card would have been that great even without the errata. It's more so that people saw that link summoning dealt with columns and they automatically thought of Senate Switch being good, even though it probably wouldn't have been that great. So Senate Switch is a continuous spell that says once per turn during your main phase, you can move one monster on your side of the field to an adjacent unoccupied monster card zone. Now the errata changes one thing, it adds a parentheses that says adjacent horizontal unoccupied monster card zone. And what that means is that you can't move a monster out of the extra monster zone to a zone below it. That's not how it works. Pretty much overnight, once that effect was announced, the hype for Senate Switch died. I mean, people no longer cared about this card. It clearly was not going to be good with Link monsters. Now, that's not to say even nowadays that this card has no uses. For what it's worth, a card like World Legacy Guard Dragon does have a similar effect, and that card is very good, but that card is also a monster reborn, so Senate Switch by itself clearly was not good enough to see competitive play. However, what makes this card even more hilarious in the context of Cyberdark Impact is that the only cards that Senate Switch works with in terms of triggering their column-based effects would be the three monsters we talked about in today's video. At this point, those were the only three monsters with column-based effects. Finally, we have Blasting Fuse, a normal trap card. Once again, here we do have an errata that I'll have to mention, but this card's original printing said activate only when all four zones of this card's column are occupied, destroy all cards in this column. Nowadays it just says all zones, not all four zones, because it could be 5 if this card was under an extra monster zone. This was by far the best of all of the column cards, but it still did have a big issue. Once again here, if you wanted to use these cards in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh at this point, you pretty much had to tell your opponent before the match started that they had to use columns and they couldn't move their cards around. But because this was the only good column card in Cyberdark Impact, if you told your opponent that, they would pretty much know that you were playing Blasting Fuse. And there goes the surprise factor, which is the only reason you would play this card. Nowadays, a card like this would have a much higher chance of working because you don't have to tell your opponent that they have to follow the column rules. But back in the day you had to, and that made this card a lot worse. As we would eventually find out in Master Rule 4, column cards could work in Yu-Gi-Oh, but they only could work if everyone was required to not move their cards around and if that was consistently enforced. Nowadays we have all sorts of cards that work with columns and it works just fine, but back in the day that wasn't really the case. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Make sure to subscribe for more episodes, and make sure to check out that playlist if you missed any of the previous installments. I'll see you later. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.